Good evening, and welcome back. Pull in close. Wherever you are listening to this, whether you are sitting in a cold car in a parking lot somewhere, putting off going inside, or lying in the dark with one earbud pressed into the pillow, or maybe sitting at a kitchen table with something warm between your hands, wherever you are, I want you to know that I am glad you are here. Drop a pin in the comments if you want. Tell me what city, what country, what hour of the night it is for you. I love knowing where these words land. Tonight, we are going all the way back. Not to Greece exactly, though Greece is part of this. Not to legend alone, though legend is woven through everything we will touch. Tonight, we're going to the steppe, to the long, wind-eaten grasslands that stretch from the Black Sea all the way east, past the Urals, past the Caspian, into the dry heart of Central Asia. We are going to the place the ancient world called the edge of the known, the place where Greek writers set their nightmares and their most extravagant fantasies. And we are going to ask a question that has been sitting unanswered for a very long time. What happens when the legend is real? What happens when you dig into the ground and the bones you find are precisely the bones the story described? What do you do with a myth that turns out to be a history? This is the story of the Amazons. It is also the story of the Scythians. It is also, and this will not become clear until we are deep inside it, the story of what we do with women who fight. Let us begin at the beginning, which is not where you expect it to be. Before there were Amazons, before there were Scythians, before the Greeks had words for either, there was the steppe. Understanding the steppe is not optional for understanding anything else in this story. It is the foundational fact, the ground condition, the thing that shapes everything that grows from it. Picture a landscape that does not end. Modern people are not good at imagining endlessness. We are accustomed to horizons that mean something, to the horizon being a limit. The Eurasian steppe offers no such comfort. It is approximately 8,000 kilometers from the Danube's mouth to Mongolia, and for most of that distance the land is flat, or nearly so, rolling in long slow swells like a frozen sea, covered in grass, not lush grass, dry grass, tawny in summer, pale and skeletal in winter, shivering in winds that have traveled enormous distances without anything to stop them. In winter, the steppe can become almost unimaginably cold. In summer, it bakes. There is very little shelter. There are very few trees. Water is scarce and seasonal. The land is not generous. And yet people lived here, not just survived, built entire civilizations here, which is the kind of thing that should give a person pause, because civilizations usually want cities, and cities want permanence, and permanence requires the land to cooperate. The steppe refuses to cooperate. The answer the steppe peoples found was mobility. You do not conquer the steppe. You move with it. You follow the grass, follow the water, follow the weather across those enormous distances, and you carry everything you need on your back or on your horses, and you do not build anything you cannot leave. This is the origin condition. This is what made the Scythians. The Scythians were not a single people in the sense that a later world would understand that term. They were a loose constellation of semi-nomadic and fully nomadic groups who shared a material culture, a set of artistic conventions, a relationship to the horse, and a broad language family that linguists now place within the Iranian branch of Indo-European. They ranged across an enormous territory from the northern shores of the Black Sea westward into what is now Ukraine and Romania, and eastward across Kazakhstan and beyond, with related cultures, Sarmatians, Saka, Masagetai, extending the pattern even further. When the Greeks called them Scythians, they were using a word that collapsed enormous diversity into a single category, the way outsiders often do when confronted with peoples they cannot quite parse. But certain things were genuinely shared, and they matter enormously for what follows. The horse. Every serious examination of Scythian culture has to start here, because everything else follows from the relationship between these people and their horses. The Scythians were among the earliest peoples to fully integrate the horse into warfare, which meant not just riding horses, but fighting from horseback, shooting, thrusting, maneuvering at speed in ways that completely changed the geometry of military engagement. The composite bow, short and recurved and powerful, drawn from horseback, fire from a gallop, accurate at distances that would have seemed impossible to foot soldiers. This was the Scythian weapon, and it was a technology that made them, for several centuries, among the most feared military forces in the world. Darius I of Persia sent an army against them and watched it dissolve into the steppe like smoke, unable to catch an enemy that simply declined to stand still. From the horse and the bow came everything else. The need for speed and mobility meant that armor, when worn, had to be light, scaled leather and bronze lamella, rather than the heavy plate that weighed down Mediterranean warriors. The practical demands of steppe life meant that everyone who could ride and shoot had value, because on the steppe, the difference between fighting and everyday life was thin. Herding horses required the same skills as raiding. Raiding required the same skills as herding. The line between defender and warrior was porous by necessity. This is where the story of the Amazons begins, though we will not use that word yet. The Greek writers who first encountered Scythian peoples in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE were confronted with something they did not have a framework for. Women who fought, not women who defended their homes in emergencies. Women who trained for combat as a regular part of life, who rode and shot alongside men who were buried with weapons because those weapons had belonged to them in life. The Greeks, and here we should be honest about what the Greeks were people who had organized their entire social world around the principle of male military capacity and female domestic enclosure. The polis, the city-state, the democratic experiment, all of it was built on the assumption that citizen men fought and citizen women stayed home. When they saw the steppe, they saw the negation of that assumption walking around on horses. What they did with this perception tells us almost as much about Greece as it does about the Scythians. They invented the Amazons. Or, and this is the more precise way to say it, they took something real, something they had seen and heard reports of, and they transformed it through the machinery of myth into something that could be contained and controlled. The Amazon myth is one of the most persistently repeated stories in all of Greek tradition. It appears in the Iliad, where a group of Amazons are mentioned briefly in passing as having been fought and defeated by Priam in his youth. It appears in the Heracles cycle, where the hero's ninth labor is to obtain the belt of the Amazon queen Hippolyta. It appears in the Theseus cycle, where the Athenian king abducts Hippolyta, or Antiope, depending on which version you follow. And the Amazons retaliate with an attack on Athens itself. It appears on the Parthenon frieze, where the battle of Greeks against Amazons, the Amazonomachy, is carved alongside the battles of Lapiths against Centaurs and Greeks against Trojans, all three serving as allegories for the triumph of civilization over chaos, order over the wild. The Amazon in Greek myth is always already defeated. This is the key structural feature. She is fierce, beautiful, skilled. The Greeks were generous about this. They did not make her weak or stupid. But she loses. She always loses. Heracles gets the belt. Achilles kills Penthesilea. Theseus captures Hippolyta. The individual Amazon warrior may display tremendous courage and skill, but the myth requires her death or defeat or domestication as its resolution. She is a test of the hero's power, and the hero must pass. It is worth sitting with this for a moment, because it is strange. The Greeks, who are capable of complex and morally ambiguous storytelling, who gave us Clytemnestra and Medea and Antigone, chose to make the Amazon almost entirely a figure of resolved contradiction. She represents the transgression of gender order, and the story is about restoring that order, again and again and again. But the thing that the myth was responding to, the thing out on the steppe, that was not resolved, that was not defeated, that was, in fact, thriving. Let's talk about what the ground has given us, because this is where the story becomes something other than literature. For much of the 20th century, the Amazon myth was treated by classical scholars as pure invention, a fantasy produced by the Greek imagination when confronted with the foreign and the frightening. The Scythians were real enough. The archaeological record confirmed that burial mounds called kurgans were found across the steppe in enormous numbers, and they contained a recognizable material culture. But the women warriors were assumed to be projection, metaphor, the male anxiety about female power rendered in narrative form. Then the excavations began to produce anomalies. Kurgan burials found in the late 20th century, particularly in the southern Urals and in the territory of modern Ukraine, began to yield female skeletons, identified as female by bone structure, buried with weapons. Not one or two as isolated curiosities, dozens, then hundreds. A comprehensive survey of Scythian-era burial sites conducted by the archaeologist Jeanine Davis Kimball found that roughly 14% of female burials in Scythian sites contained weapons or battle-related artifacts. That is not a symbolic occurrence. That is a pattern. More telling still was what the bones themselves said. Weapons in burials can be ritual, ceremonial, placed as status markers rather than evidence of use. But bones keep their own record. Female skeletons from Scythian-era kurgans showed in measurable numbers the physical signatures of a lifetime of archery and riding. Enlarged muscle attachment points on the right arm and shoulder from repeated bowstring pull. Asymmetrical bone development consistent with years of mounted combat training, and in some cases, healed injuries whose pattern matched combat wounds. One skeleton found at a site called Pokrovka in the Orenburg region of Russia was a young woman estimated to have died between 16 and 18 years of age. She was buried with 2 iron spearheads, a quiver of bronze-tipped arrows, and a stone altar. Her leg bones showed the bowed development, consistent with extensive horseback riding. She had a battle injury on her left leg, partly healed. She had been a warrior, and she had died young, and someone had given her a warrior's burial. The Greeks were not making it up. They were, as they always did, transforming what was real into what was useful. But the kernel was there. The women who fought were there. The question that opens up from this, and it is a large question, larger than it might first appear, is what it meant. Not to the Greeks, to the Scythians themselves. What was the social structure that produced female warriors? What was the world in which a girl could grow up to become what that girl at Pokrovka apparently was? The answer requires understanding the steppe as a system, not just a backdrop. Nomadic pastoral societies face a set of recurring logistical problems that sedentary agricultural societies do not. The most fundamental is defense versus subsistence. A farming community can specialize. Some people grow food, others defend the village. The community's survival does not require every adult to be capable of fighting, because the fighters can be supported by the farmers, and the community is not going anywhere. Mobility is not required for survival. On the steppe, this division of labor is not available in the same way. When a group is moving, and steppe nomads were often moving, following seasonal patterns that might take a band hundreds of kilometers between summer and winter pastures. Everyone has to contribute to both survival and security. If raiders come when the main body of warriors is elsewhere, you cannot wait for help. You cannot call for reinforcements. The defense of the group falls on whoever is present, and whoever is present had better know how to fight. This is an ecological argument for female military training, and it is probably true as far as it goes, but it does not go far enough, because what the archaeological record suggests is not just emergency preparedness. Some of the women whose remains have been found show lifelong intensive specialization in combat, not people who could defend themselves in a pinch, but people for whom fighting was a vocation. The question of what status such women held, whether they were exceptional individuals, a recognized social class, a ritual category, something else entirely, this remains genuinely open. The steppe peoples did not leave written records. Everything we know about their inner lives comes from the ground, from the occasional mentions in Greek and Persian texts, which come with their own distortions, and from inference. What we can say is this: the Scythian world had space for the warrior woman in a way that the Greek world, almost by definition, did not. The material record proves she existed. The myth the Greeks built around her proves she was seen. Now, let us go deeper into the world that made her. And to do that, we have to go back further, back to the great upheavals of the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, when the steppe itself was reorganizing, when new peoples moved into new territories, when the shape of the world was being renegotiated in ways that would determine everything that came after. The question of origins on the Eurasian steppe is genuinely vexed, the kind of thing that professional archaeologists and geneticists argue about in journals with great intensity and occasional personal animosity, but certain broad outlines are clear. The pastoralist cultures that would eventually produce what we call Scythian civilization emerged from a deep history of interaction between forest steppe communities in the north and western steppe communities extending toward the Pontic region, the area north of the Black Sea. By roughly the 9th century BCE, a recognizable Scythian culture was consolidating in this region, characterized by the Kurgan burial tradition, the composite bow, the distinctive animal-style art, horses and deer and predators locked in the endlessly coiling embrace of Scythian metalwork, and the fully mobile pastoral economy. But before the Scythians, there were other powers on the steppe. The Cimmerians held the Pontic steppe before the Scythians came from the east, and the Scythians drove them out, pushing them westward into Anatolia, where they raided and settled and eventually disappeared from history. Before the Cimmerians, there were others whose names we have lost. The steppe was never empty. It was always a palimpsest, layers of culture written over layers of culture, and the dominant power at any given moment was always aware, at some level, that dominance on the steppe was not permanent. This is the first great truth that the steppe teaches, and the Scythians knew it in their bones. Everything passes. The rolling grass absorbs the bones of the mighty along with everyone else. The wind does not distinguish. This knowledge, call it the steppe cosmology, shaped everything about how Scythian peoples structured their relationship to power, to the divine, to death. Their religious world, reconstructed from burial evidence and from the accounts of Herodotus, who visited the Black Sea region in the 5th century BCE and recorded what he saw and heard with a particular mix of accuracy and editorializing that makes him invaluable and maddening in equal measure, was organized around a pantheon of deities who mapped onto natural forces rather than human social structures. Tabiti, a goddess of fire and the hearth, occupied the highest position, a female deity at the apex of the Scythian divine order, which is itself interesting and worth noting. Papeus was a sky father, Api, a goddess of the earth. Oitosiros, whom Herodotus identifies with Apollo, was a solar deity. Archimpasa, identified with Aphrodite, had a particular association with gender liminality that we will return to because it matters. Thagimasadas, identified with Poseidon, was worshipped particularly by the royal Scythians, the most powerful and prestigious of the Scythian groups. What strikes me about this pantheon, and I want to be honest here, this is a judgment call. I am aware that reconstructing Scythian theology from Herodotus and burial goods is inherently uncertain. What strikes me is the centrality of fire and the earth, the elements that sustain rather than merely dominate. Tabiti's primacy suggests a world in which the qualities associated with fire, warmth, transformation, the hearth community, the boundary between inside and outside, were considered foundational in a way that had cosmological weight. This is not merely a detail about religious practice. It is a window into how Scythian society organized its values. There is also the matter of the Ennerai, which Herodotus mentions with a kind of fascinated discomfort. The Ennerai were a category of individuals assigned male at birth based on Greek descriptions, who lived as women, adopted female roles, and were credited with prophetic powers. Herodotus says this condition was understood as a divine punishment, a feminine sickness sent by a goddess to those who had desecrated her shrine in Asia. But the detail that they held prophetic authority and were respected for it suggests something more complicated than punishment. The Ennerai occupy a gender category that the Scythian world apparently had a concept for and a social role to fit, which is, and here I want to choose words carefully, not something that all ancient societies had, and not something the Greeks, with their rigid gender binary, quite knew how to process. The Argimpasa connection is suggestive. The goddess associated with gender liminality was also the goddess of love and war, Aphrodite's domain, but with a steppe inflection. On the steppe, the boundaries that Mediterranean civilization drew so carefully were more porous. The warrior might be a woman. The priest might be neither man nor woman in any simple sense. The divine might speak through channels that the settled world had walled off. This is the ground from which the Amazon grows, not from chaos or barbarism, as the Greek myth would have it. From a different ordering of the possible, now we must talk about power, about what happened when the Scythian world reached its height, and about the forces that defined and contested and ultimately transformed it. By the 7th century BCE, the Scythians were a major military power on the edges of the ancient world's consciousness. They had pushed the Cimmerians out of the Pontic steppe. They had raided into the Near East with sufficient force to temporarily dominate portions of what is now Iran, Turkey, and the Levant. Assyrian records mention them. Egyptian pharaohs negotiated with them. The great empires of the ancient Near East, which regarded their own dominance as cosmically ordained, found themselves dealing with these horse-born people from the north as if they were a power to be reckoned with, because they were. What gave them this power was not numbers. In terms of raw population, the Scythians could not compete with the Persian Empire or the Assyrian Empire at their heights. What they had was something that those empires found nearly impossible to counter. They could not be pinned down. The classic strategy of ancient warfare, march to the enemy's heartland, destroy their army in pitched battle, seize their cities, simply did not apply to a people who had no fixed heartland, who could absorb a pitched battle by retreating, and who had no cities. When Darius I launched his expedition against the Scythians around 513 BCE, he commanded an army variously estimated in the hundreds of thousands, and the Scythians simply moved. They drew him eastward, burning the grass ahead of him to deny his horses forage, polluting water sources, striking his foraging parties, and falling back before he could respond. And eventually, Darius had to retreat before his enormous army consumed itself. The Scythians demonstrated that wealth and numbers and organizational capacity, all the things empires were built from, could be neutralized by space and mobility. It was one of the first great lessons in asymmetric warfare, and it was learned in the open classroom of the Eurasian steppe. Within Scythian society, power was organized in a way that combined elements of kingship with something more diffuse. The royal Scythians, as Herodotus calls them, occupied the apex of a loose hierarchy, and the Scythian king was a figure of genuine authority, but authority that was conditional, that required demonstration, that could be contested. There are accounts of ritual mechanisms by which a sick or weak king could be replaced, of the king's vulnerability as both a spiritual and political matter. And there are the queens. Here we must slow down. The burial record includes, among its most spectacular finds, female burials of extraordinary richness. Women interred with gold torques and gold vessels and weapons and horses, with a kind of material wealth that signals genuine high status, not honorary status, not symbolic elevation, but the real concentration of resources that says, this person commanded. One of the most famous of these, excavated in Ukraine in the 1970s and known in the archaeological literature as the Melgunov burial or the Litoy Kurgan, belonged to a woman of the Scythian elite, buried with a golden crown, weapons, and bronze cauldrons. Another, from a site in the Dnieper region, included a woman whose burial goods were indistinguishable in quality from those of known high-status male burials nearby. Whether these women were queens in the formal sense, whether they held political power in their own right, or inherited it, or exercised it through consort relationships, or achieved it through some other mechanism, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that the Scythian world had mechanisms for the accumulation of female power and the formal recognition of it in the most permanent medium available, the architecture of death. There is a story in Herodotus that does not get enough attention. He describes, in his account of the Sarmatians, a people closely related to the Scythians, sometimes treated as a subdivision of them. A specific origin myth. The Sarmatians, he says, were descended from a union between Scythian men and a group of Amazons who had been captured by the Greeks after a battle, transported by ship, and escaped when they killed their Greek captors at sea. The escaped Amazons, drifting in an oarless ship, came ashore near Scythian territory. The young Scythian men, sent to deal with them, eventually made peace. The Amazons were apparently not interested in being dealt with, and in time, the groups intermarried. When the Scythians proposed that they come back to live with the Scythian community, the Amazon women gave an answer that Herodotus puts in their mouths with evident delight. "We could not live with your women," they said. "Our customs and theirs are different. We ride and shoot and hunt. We do not do women's work. We cannot take up a way of life we were not raised for." The Sarmatian women, Herodotus explains, continued to ride and hunt and go to war after the marriage, and their daughters did the same. And there was a rule: no young woman could marry until she had killed a man in battle. This is mythological explanation, clearly, an etiology for observed cultural practice, the kind of foundational story that a people tells to explain why they are the way they are. But what it explains is something real, a society in which women's military participation was a recognized, formalized, institutionally significant category. The Greek writers found this scandalous. They found it fascinating. They could not stop writing about it, which is itself a kind of testimony. The Amazon story, in its dozens of iterations across Greek literature and art, is the record of a culture trying to process a social reality it had no framework to accommodate. Every time a Greek writer described the Amazons cutting off their right breasts for better bowstring clearance, a detail that has no basis in the archaeological or physical anthropological record and is almost certainly pure Greek invention. They were displacing their anxiety about what they had seen and heard into a grotesque literalism that made the women warriors into monsters rather than people. You do not need to explain away the physical capacity of a woman who fights as mutilation, unless you are deeply invested in the idea that women's bodies are not built for fighting. The detail of the breast removal is the Greek imagination flinching. But the women did not flinch. Let us turn now to the lives of individual women whom the record has preserved, or almost preserved. Women who stand at the edge of history and legend, whose names have survived either in the Greek sources or in the fragmentary archaeological record, or in both, and whose stories carry within them the shape of something real. The first is Tomyris. Tomyris was a queen of the Massagetæ, a people of the eastern steppe, kin or close neighbors of the Scythians, who held territory east of the Caspian Sea. She ruled in her own right, not as regent, not as consort, but as sovereign, following the death of her husband. Herodotus, who is our source, treats her political authority as unremarkable, which is itself interesting. He does not apologize for a female ruler or explain how such an anomaly came to be. She is the queen of the Massagetæ. That is what she is. Into her story came Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, conqueror of Lydia, conqueror of Babylon, the most successful military commander of the 6th century BCE. Cyrus has spent his career absorbing neighbors into his empire, and the Massagetæ were on the list. He began with a diplomatic approach. He proposed marriage to Tomyris. She turned him down, and Herodotus says she understood exactly what he was doing, that he was seeking her kingdom, not her person. Then he began building a bridge across the Araxes River to invade her territory. What followed was one of the most striking episodes in Herodotus's entire history, and Herodotus tells it with a clarity and lack of editorializing that suggests he found it, on some level, simply true. Tomyris sent a message to Cyrus. "Abandon this invasion," she told him. "You cannot know whether the outcome will be good for you. Rule your own people and endure the sight of me ruling mine." She told him that if he did not stop, she would give him more blood than he could drink. Cyrus did not stop. There was a battle. In the first engagement, the Persians used a stratagem. They set out a camp laden with food and wine, and then retreated, and the Massagetæan force led by Tomyris' son Spargapises attacked the camp, feasted, and was overwhelmed in a night assault. Spargapises was taken captive. When he regained his senses and understood his situation, he asked to be unbound, was granted the request, and killed himself rather than remain a prisoner. When Tomyris received word of her son's death and the manner of it, Herodotus records that she told Cyrus he had not conquered her son in fair fight, but had intoxicated him, which was how he had prevailed. She promised a full battle. The battle came. Herodotus calls it the fiercest between non-Greek peoples that he knows of. He says the Massagetæ won. He says Cyrus was killed. He says Tomyris found his body, or was brought it, and that she cut off his head and submerged it in a vessel of human blood, saying, "I promised you blood. Now drink your fill." There is no way to verify this account. Persian sources say nothing about it. Persian sources say nothing about Cyrus's death at all, which is suspicious in its own way. The Greek tradition has multiple competing accounts of how Cyrus died, which means nobody really knew. But the Tomyris story has a specific quality, a precision of psychological portraiture, a logic of action that feels rooted in something experienced rather than invented. The detail of spargapices, the capture and the suicide, the grief of the mother transmuted into military resolution. This is not the flatly symbolic thing that Greek Amazon stories usually are. This is complicated. This is a woman who loses something irreplaceable and responds by winning anyway. Some say Tomyris kept the head of Cyrus as a trophy for years. Others say she ordered it buried with full military honors because even in victory, she recognized the magnitude of the man she had defeated. The two versions are not as incompatible as they seem. She might have done both, displayed the trophy, and then, eventually, when the point had been made beyond any possibility of doubt, shown the mercy that power can afford. Whatever the exact truth, the outcome was not disputed in antiquity. Cyrus the Great, who had conquered most of the known world, was defeated and killed by a woman on the steppe. The most powerful empire builder of his era was brought down not by another empire, but by a queen with horses and archers and a dead son and a promise she intended to keep. This is the kind of thing that happens on the steppe. The second figure we need to visit is Atalanta, and I want to approach her carefully because she is not Scythian. She is Greek. She is entirely mythological, at least in the sense that no one has found her burial mound. But she is, I think, the echo within Greek culture of the thing the steppe represented, and that makes her important. Atalanta is one of the most ancient figures in Greek myth, appearing in sources that predate the classical period. She was the daughter of a king of Arcadia or Boeotia, depending on which version, who, having been told by an oracle that marriage would destroy her, refused to marry and instead lived as a hunter, running wild in the mountains, swift beyond mortal comparison, a better runner than any man alive, a skilled archer. She participated in the Caledonian boar hunt, one of the great collective adventures of Greek mythology, and she drew first blood on the monstrous boar that had been ravaging Caledon, shooting it with an arrow before any of the male heroes got near enough to strike. Meleager, who had called her to the hunt against the protests of the other men, gave her the boar's pelt as her prize, which caused a crisis that eventually cost him his life. Women were not supposed to take prizes from hunts. Women were not supposed to be at hunts. Atalanta's excellence was a disorder in the social cosmos. She was eventually tricked into marriage by Hippomenes, who threw golden apples in her path during a foot race, a race whose stakes, for any man she defeated, were death. She paused to pick up the apples and lost, and having lost, she married, and the oracle was fulfilled. She and Hippomenes were transformed into lions as punishment for desecrating a shrine to Zeus, or Cybele, or Rhea in some versions. What the myth does with Atalanta is characteristic. She is extraordinary. She is, in a meaningful sense, the best hunter, the fastest runner, a figure of physical excellence that the Greek tradition usually reserved for men. But the myth cannot let her stay that way. The oracle is the machinery that keeps her contained. She cannot thrive as she is, so she must become something else. And the transformation into a lion at the end is the myth's way of admitting that it has nowhere to put her. She was too good to be fully human by Greek standards. The lion is what happens when the social category ruptures. But here is what I want to notice. Atalanta's story keeps surviving. She gets told and retold, painted and sculpted, held up as an example even in contexts where the example seems to undermine the moral the storyteller intends. Greek culture could not stop returning to her, which suggests that she answered something, touched something in the Greek imagination that wanted to exist but had no proper outlet. She was the Amazon who lived in the myth's own house. The third figure is Antiope. Antiope was, in the most common version of the myth, the Amazon queen who was abducted by Theseus, brought to Athens, and became his consort. She bore him a son, Hippolytus. When the Amazons came to recover her, or to avenge her, depending on the source, she fought alongside Theseus against her own people and was killed in the battle. In some versions, she dies in combat. In some versions, she dies later, after Theseus abandons her for another marriage, her grief becoming the instrument of Hippolytus's destruction through the mechanism of Phaedra's obsession. Antiope is the Amazon who chooses Athens, who crosses the line between Amazon and Greek, between the steppe world and the city world, and is destroyed in the crossing. Her tragedy is not that she was conquered. She was not conquered. She fell in love, or was taken, or chose, depending on the version you follow. Her tragedy is that the line she crossed cannot actually be crossed. The world she entered had no place for her, and the world she left considered her a traitor. She existed in the gap between two social systems that did not have vocabulary for what she was. There is something, I want to say something careful here, because I'm aware that reaching for contemporary resonance is a trap. There is something about Antiope that speaks to a recognizable human situation. The person who has been formed by one world and transplanted into another, who tries to be useful, to be loyal, to find a place in the new context, and discovers that the new context does not actually want to integrate her. It wants to display her. It wants to use her skills in defense of its own interests, but it will not change its fundamental structure to accommodate her. And when the crisis comes, when she is no longer strategically useful, she is expendable. This is not just a women's story. It is a story about what happens when you ask someone to fully assimilate into a world that was not built for them and never will be. Antiope answers that question. They die. Some say Theseus wept at her death. Some say he did not. The fourth figure is Penthesilea. Penthesilea is the Amazon queen who comes to Troy. She comes after the main action of the Iliad. Her story is told in the Aethiopis, one of the lost epics of the Trojan War cycle, surviving only in summaries and fragments. She comes, in most versions, because she has killed her sister Hippolyta accidentally during a hunt with a javelin, and she is consumed by grief and guilt and is seeking, essentially, a warrior's death on a glorious battlefield. She comes to fight and to die. At Troy, she fights brilliantly. The sources that describe her Trojan campaign, Quintus of Smyrna, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier material, paint her as a figure of almost supernatural military effectiveness sweeping through the Greek army, briefly turning the tide of the war, putting fear into men who had fought for 10 years and should have been past fear in anything. She kills Greeks. She drives the Greeks back. For a moment, she makes Troy feel like it might survive. Then she meets Achilles. The moment of their combat is one of the most loaded scenes in the entire Trojan War mythology. Achilles kills her. This is required by the structure of the myth. The hero must win, the Amazon must die. But in the moment of her death, something unexpected happens. He looks at her, and the tradition, in its various versions, keeps circling back to this moment of looking as though it contains something that cannot be properly explained. In some versions, Achilles falls in love with Penthesilea at the moment he kills her, which is an image the Greeks seem to find both irresistible and troubling. Eros and death collapse into a single instant, the most extreme possible form of the idea that love and destruction are the same force wearing different faces. In others, he weeps over her body. In others, he is mocked for his grief by the soldier Thersites, who either desecrates the body or simply sneers, and Achilles kills Thersites on the spot. Penthesilea comes to Troy to die, and the myth is honest about this. She is not naive. She is not deceived about what fighting Achilles means. She is a woman who has done something unforgivable, killed her sister, and who has decided that the only adequate response to unforgivable things is to spend herself completely in a great act, to die at the peak of her powers doing the only thing she was fully formed to do. There is a logic to this that is terrible and coherent. The grief she carries is the kind that cannot be lived with, only endured until the body gives out. And yet she fights so well. She fights so well that the myth has to work hard to contain her. The Greeks needed her to lose, and she does lose, but her losing costs something. It costs Achilles something he cannot name. It costs Thersites his life for naming it wrong. This is what the Amazon myth does at its most honest. It admits that the world's insistence on female defeat is not costless. Something is lost when Penthesilea dies. The myth knows it. The myth cannot avoid knowing it. And so it buries the knowledge in the moment of Achilles looking down at the woman he has killed and feeling something he cannot process, something that his entire heroic framework gives him no tools for. He loved her after he killed her, or he was horrified by what he had done. The sources disagree, which is how Greek myth handles things it cannot resolve. I need to pause here. The thread has gotten complicated. There are 5 centuries and 2 continents, and the distance between legend and archaeology tangled together in what I have been building, and I want to make sure we have not lost the shape of it. What we have established, the Scythian world produced female warriors as a real, documented, physical, anthropologically confirmed phenomenon. The Greek world, confronted with this reality, built the Amazon myth as a way to process and contain it. The myth required the warrior woman to be defeated or domesticated. The reality did not cooperate with the requirement. The two things, the myth and the reality, lived in a kind of tension for several centuries, producing some of the most interesting stories in the ancient world, stories that kept failing to fully close, to fully resolve the contradiction they were built to resolve. Now we go further. Now we go to the moment when the world changed. The 4th century BCE brought a series of shocks to the Scythian world that are impossible to overstate. From the west came the Macedonians, Philip II, and then his son Alexander, who was building an empire of a different kind, one that moved with Scythian-like speed, but with the organizational depth of the polis behind it. Philip fought the Scythians directly in 339 BCE in a battle that killed the Scythian king Artaeus, who was reportedly 90 years old and still commanding his own forces in the field, which is either historical fact or legend about how a steppe king dies. Either way, the Macedonians won, and they kept winning along the Danube frontier. From the east came something even more transformative: the Sarmatians. The Sarmatians were kin to the Scythians in language and culture, but they had been developing east of the Don River for centuries, and by the 3rd century BCE, they were moving west in force. The pressure they applied was inexorable. The Scythian population of the Pontic steppe was compressed, pushed southward, eventually reduced to a remnant kingdom in Crimea and the Crimean approaches. The great Scythian confederacy that had made Persia flinch was gone by the 2nd century BCE, not destroyed by a single dramatic conquest, but slowly ground down between external pressures and internal fracturing. The Sarmatians, who replaced them, had their own culture and their own warrior women. The Sarmatian female burials that have been excavated are, if anything, more consistent in their military associations than the Scythian ones. The Sauramatian/Sarmatian tradition of female warriors seems to have been, if anything, more institutionalized than its Scythian predecessor. This is the culture that Herodotus's Amazonian origin myth was specifically constructed to explain. Whether the myth preceded the reality or followed it, or whether they grew up together in some more complicated way, is a question archaeologists are still arguing. What matters for this story is the continuity. The warrior women of the steppe did not disappear when the Scythians faded. They persisted, shifted, adapted to new conditions. The tradition was deep-rooted enough to survive the collapse of the specific political formation that had carried it. There is also the question of what happened to individual women in this period of disruption. And here, the archaeological record becomes both more specific and more heartbreaking. A burial found at a site called Filipovka in the southern Urals, dating from approximately the 4th century BCE, belonged to a woman of Sarmatian culture who had been buried with a golden torque, a bronze mirror, and a set of weapons, including an akinakes, the short Scythian sword, and a quiver. She was elderly by steppe standards. The bone analysis suggests she was between 40 and 50 years old at death, and her skeleton showed significant spinal arthritis consistent with years of mounted riding. She had outlived what the average steppe life offered to most people. She had fought, apparently, for a long time, and she had survived her fighting, and she died respected, given the burial goods of someone who mattered. I think about her sometimes, not as a symbol, as a person. The woman in the Filipovka burial. What 40 years of riding the steppe had looked like from the inside. What she thought about, lying in her tent in the winter dark, with her back aching and her horses breathing in the cold outside, and the grass going all the way to the edge of the world. I cannot know. Nobody can know. The ground gives us bones and gold and iron. It does not give us the interior life, but it gives us something. Anyway, the Greek cities of the Black Sea coast, Olbia, Chersonesus, Pantikapaeum, had been living in close contact with Scythian and then Sarmatian culture for centuries, and the evidence of this contact is everywhere in the archaeological record. Greek artists made Scythian-style metalwork. Scythian nobles are buried with Greek pottery alongside their native goods. There are bilingual inscriptions. There are grave markers for people with mixed Greek and Iranian names. The boundary between the civilized and the barbaric, which Greek ideology maintained with such insistence, was in practice extremely porous. The city and the steppe did commerce in goods and in people and in ideas, and the Amazon myth, which was supposed to hold that boundary firm, was being quietly undermined by the reality of daily life along the Black Sea rim. There is a specific artifact class that tells this story better than almost anything else. The Attic red figure vases depicting Amazons that were found, in some cases, not in Greece at all, but in Scythian or Thracian burials. Greek artists made images of Amazons fighting Greek heroes, and Scythian adjacent people bought them and kept them and were buried with them. The most charitable interpretation is that the Scythian purchasers saw themselves in the Amazon figures, that they recognized something of their own world in the image the Greek artist had made, even though the Greek artist intended the image as a story of Greek triumph. The less charitable interpretation is that status objects were status objects regardless of their ideological content, and rich people bought Greek pottery because it was expensive and beautiful, and you could put wine in it. Probably both interpretations are true simultaneously. That is usually how cultural exchange works. Let me collect the thread here, because the broader historical argument is this: the Amazons were not a Greek invention superimposed on an empty steppe. They were a Greek translation, often reductive and anxiety-driven, of a social reality that the steppe had developed over centuries for specific ecological and cultural reasons. The translation distorted the original. Every translation does. But the original was there, and it persisted, and it left its mark on the ground in the form of bones and grave goods and the physical architecture of lives spent in combat. What does it mean that women fought on the steppe? What did it mean then to the people living it? Here we are in the territory where the evidence runs thin and the inference runs long, and I want to be transparent about that. What follows is interpretation, built on the best available evidence, but interpretation nonetheless. The steppe warrior woman was not, I think, primarily understood as a transgressor of gender norms. This is the Greek framework, and it is a framework built on the assumption that fighting and femininity are fundamentally incompatible, that a woman who fights has stepped outside the category of woman in some important sense. The steppe framework, to the extent that we can reconstruct it from burial evidence and comparative ethnography, does not seem to have operated this way. The evidence suggests that the warrior woman on the steppe was a recognized social type, one among several occupying a specific position in the community's understanding of itself. She was not an exception to the rule. She was one expression of a social order that had more room in it than the Greek order did. This does not mean the steppe was an egalitarian paradise. It emphatically was not. The archaeological record shows substantial material inequality. The gold and horses buried with elite individuals represent the extraction of surplus from a pastoral economy that supported most people at a much more modest level. There were hierarchies of power and prestige, and those hierarchies were reproduced through the burial practices that are our primary source. But within those hierarchies, gender appears to have been a less determining variable than it was in the Mediterranean world. Some women commanded, some women fought, some women accumulated wealth and buried it with them as testament to what they had been in life. This is not nothing in a world where most societies built their formal structures on the exclusion of women from the category of full social actor. The steppe offered an alternative, not as ideology, not as deliberate feminism, but as practical accommodation to the conditions of life on the grass. The Greek myth about this alternative is a story about defeat. The Amazon always loses. The transgressive woman is always returned to the proper order, by death, by domestication, by divine punishment, by the superior valor of the male hero. The story the myth tells is, this is not sustainable. This is a violation of nature. The hero's job is to restore the violated order, but the bones say something different. The bones say the alternative was sustained for centuries, across thousands of kilometers of steppe. The bones say the women who fought grew old fighting, sometimes, and were buried with their weapons and their horses and their gold by people who understood that this was who they had been. The bones say the Greek myth was not describing reality. It was arguing against it. And the bones kept winning that argument for a very long time. Let us turn now to the great collective event, the moment when the steppe world and the Mediterranean world collided most directly and consequentially, when the figures we have been tracking became part of the same story. This is not a single battle. It is a long engagement spanning roughly 3 centuries between the Greek colonial world of the Black Sea and the various steppe peoples who surrounded and penetrated it. But it has one central episode that crystallizes everything: the Scythian occupation of the Near East in the 7th century BCE, which Greek and Hebrew and Assyrian sources record with varying levels of panic and precision, and which left enough mark on the cultural record to suggest that it was genuinely formative. The Scythians, or a major force from the steppe, entered Anatolia and the Levant around 630 BCE, following the routes used by the Sumerians before them. They reached as far as Egypt, or nearly. Herodotus says they were turned back by Psamtik I with gifts and diplomacy. They raided and dominated parts of the Near East for approximately 28 years before being expelled by the Medes. The Hebrew prophet Jeremiah wrote about them with imagery so vivid that scholars have used the passage, "The foe from the north, swift as eagles, armed with bows, speaking a language no one knows," as historical corroboration of the Scythian presence. The Assyrian records mention the Ashkuza, which is almost certainly the Scythians, sometimes as enemies and sometimes as useful allies against the Cimmerians. What the Scythian incursion into the Near East meant, structurally, is that for approximately a generation, a steppe power controlled significant portions of the settled world. They did not build cities. They did not install governors or administer territories in the way that empires administered territories. They extracted tribute and moved on. The Near Eastern world experienced them the way a storm is experienced. Violent, transformative, fundamentally impossible to reason with in the categories that the settled world used to reason about power. And within those forces, scattered through the steppe armies that swept through the ancient Near East, there were women who fought. We cannot name them. We cannot point to a specific archaeological find and say, this woman was at the Battle of X, or this woman participated in the raid on Y. The historical record does not preserve individual steppe women in the way it preserves individual Greek heroes. The bones we have are mostly anonymous, their stories inferential, but they were there. The culture that produced the female warrior did not suddenly set that practice aside when it went campaigning. The Filipovka woman's ancestors were there. The girl from Pokrovka's aunts were there. They rode into the ancient Near East alongside their brothers and husbands and fathers, and they shot their bows at Assyrian infantry, and they rode south toward Egypt, and they were part of the thing that made the world shake. There is a recklessness to imagining this that I want to acknowledge. The temptation to project a drama onto figures who have left almost no trace in the written record. I am aware of the temptation. I'm going to give into it anyway, partially, because the temptation is answering something true. The absence of named women in the historical record is not evidence that they were absent from the history. It is evidence that the people who wrote the records did not think their names worth preserving. That is a different thing, and it is worth being angry about for a moment before moving on. Moving on. The aftermath of the Scythian era in the Near East was, for the steppe world, a period of consolidation, and then, slowly, of retreat. The Scythian dominance of the Black Sea steppe reached its peak in the 5th and 4th centuries, BCE. This is the period Herodotus was writing about, and his account captures both the power and the complexity of Scythian civilization at its height. The Kurgan burials from this period are among the most spectacular ever found. The Soloka Kurgan, the Chertomlik Kurgan, the Tolstaya Mogila, containing objects of gold and bronze and iron of extraordinary quality and beauty. The great golden pectoral found at Tolstaya Mogila, now in the National Museum of the History of Ukraine, is one of the finest pieces of metalwork from the ancient world. A semicircular breastplate divided into 3 registers, showing in its middle register animals nursing their young and domesticated activities of steppe life, and in its outer registers animals in mortal combat, predators tearing prey in the endless violent loop of the natural world. It is also, significantly, an object whose exact social function is disputed. Was it kingly regalia, a ritual object, a wedding gift? Scholars argue. The object itself is mute on the question, beautiful and ambiguous. The women of this period's burials are proportionally represented in the richest finds. The Melgunov sword, the earliest Scythian gold find of major significance, was found in a burial that may have belonged to a woman. Nymphaeon, the Greek city on the Crimean coast, has produced female burials in Scythian style with weapons and gold that suggest women of the highest elite status were regular features of this world. And then the pressure came. The Macedonians from the west, the Sarmatians from the east, the client relationships with Greek cities becoming dependencies and then dominations, the Scythian Confederacy, which had never been a state in the formal sense, which had always been a loose network of groups held together by shared culture and strategic interest, began to fracture under pressure from multiple directions. By the 2nd century BCE, what remained of the Scythians as a distinct cultural force was a diminished kingdom centered on the Crimea and the lower Dnieper, fighting defensive wars against Greek cities and Sarmatian neighbors alike. The steppe that had made them was now in other hands. This is the great elegy. The steppe does not hold power for long. The lesson the Scythians had practiced for so long, that nothing is permanent, that the wind and the grass outlast all particular arrangements, was eventually applied to themselves. The Sarmatians who replaced them had the warrior women. The warrior women continued. But the specific political form that had given Scythian civilization its distinctive character, the horsemen of the Pontic steppe, the people who had made Darius retreat and killed Cyrus and carried Scythian gold across half the ancient world, that form was gone. What was left was the memory and the myth. The Greeks had been telling Amazon stories for centuries before the Scythian collapse. They continued telling them after. The Amazons of Greek myth became increasingly fantastical as the real steppe world receded from direct Greek experience, or rather, they became increasingly stereotyped, increasingly a fixed iconographic type rather than a response to observed reality. The Amazon on Attic pottery of the 5th century BCE has specific Scythian visual markers: pointed cap, trousers, short bow, patterned garments. These are not generalizations, and these are the specific visual vocabulary of the steppe peoples as the Greeks saw them. By the Hellenistic period, the Amazon is more generically barbarian, the specific steppe markers fading. By the Roman period, the Amazon is essentially a literary convention, a marker of a certain kind of adventurous, classical reference, rather than an image derived from anything real. But she keeps being told. She keeps appearing. Roman poets, Byzantine historians, medieval compilers, Renaissance painters, Enlightenment philosophers using her as an example, either of the natural state of humanity or of the natural disorder when civilization fails. Down through the centuries, the Amazon refuses to die. This is interesting and worth thinking about slowly. The persistence of the Amazon myth through cultures that had no direct contact with the steppe world, through periods when nobody was likely to encounter a Scythian woman on horseback, suggests that the myth was answering something that had nothing to do with the specific historical reality of Scythian female warriors. It was answering something in the structure of human social organization, specifically the question of what to do with women who want the things that social systems designate as male. The warrior woman is the extreme form of this question, but she stands in for a broader class of women who exceed their assigned category. The woman who rules, who reasons publicly, who competes, who refuses domestic enclosure. The Amazon myth says, she is real, she is formidable, and she must be defeated. Every generation that retells the myth is relitigating the question. Every hero who fights an Amazon is re-performing the act of containment. The fight never stays won. The myth has to be told again because the question it is trying to answer keeps reoccurring. There is something almost like an admission in this. If the social order were as natural and inevitable as its defenders claim, it would not require constant mythological reinforcement. The fact that the Amazon keeps having to be killed suggests that the Amazon keeps coming back to life. The bones knew this. The bones had been saying it for centuries, in the kurgans of the Pontic steppe, in the burial mounds of the Ural foothills, in the graves of girls who died young with arrowheads in their quivers and bowed legs from a life on horseback. The bones said, "We were here, we were real. We fought and we died, and some of us lived a long time, fighting and dying, and our people buried us with the things that had been ours in life, because they knew what we had been, and they thought it worth remembering." The Greek myth said, "Yes, but you lost." The bones said, "Look again." Let me try a comparison that almost works. The relationship between the Amazon myth and the archaeological Scythian warrior woman is something like a photographic negative of a truth. All the shapes are present, but the light and dark are reversed. The negative shows you something real about the original, but you have to account for the inversion before you can trust what you see. The myth shows you the warrior woman, but it shows her in defeat, which is the inversion of her historical reality. Account for the inversion, and the myth becomes a document of the thing it was trying to contain. The anachronism creeps in here, briefly, unbidden. It is difficult not to feel the long shadow of the Amazon myth's logic in later centuries, in later continents, in contexts that have nothing to do with the Eurasian steppe. The recurring insistence that some categories of person must be contained, must be shown to lose, must be given their place within the structure rather than allowed to exceed it. This is not a Scythian problem or a Greek problem. It is a recurring feature of how social orders defend themselves. The bones are still being dug up. The question is still being asked. But that is closer to today than tonight's story goes. Tonight's story belongs to the steppe. What the Scythian warrior woman means, historically, is this: the assumption that patriarchal military monopoly is a universal feature of human social organization is false. It was false in the historical period. The material record proves it. Whether it is a biological inevitability or a social construction is a question the steppe answered thousands of years ago with the physical bodies of women who trained to fight, fought, lived long, fighting careers, and died respected for what they had been. This does not require the steppe to have been utopian or equal. It does not require Scythian society to have been organized around the liberation of women in any recognizable modern sense. It requires only that the conditions of steppe life, the ecology of mobility, the practical demands of pastoral nomadism, the cultural inheritance of a people who lived close to the margin and needed everyone to be capable, created space for a social type that most of the world's other major civilizations defined out of existence. The Greek myth closed that space in the imagination. Archaeology has reopened it. The steppe is not empty anymore, in one sense. It is full of universities and roads and cities. In another sense, it is still the grass, still the wind, still the long horizon that does not end. The kurgans are still there, most of them rising from the Ukrainian and Kazakh and Russian plains, as they have risen for 2,500 years. Some have been excavated, many have not. every year, something else comes out of the ground. There is a burial at a site in Kazakhstan, excavated in the 1990s, that I keep thinking about as a kind of emblem for everything this story contains. The burial belonged to a woman of Saka culture, the eastern cousins of the Scythians, who had been interred with a headdress of extraordinary complexity, the kind of headdress that indicates a person of very high ceremonial status, possibly a priestess or a shaman queen. She was also buried with weapons. She was also buried with a bronze mirror, one of the consistent markers of female high status across steppe cultures. She had been buried as simultaneously a fighter, a spiritual authority, and a person of secular power. The excavators, before they had cleaned the bones sufficiently to determine sex, assumed they had found a man because the weapons pointed to a man, and the steppe imagination in the late Soviet academic world had still not fully recalibrated away from the assumption that fighting and maleness were the same thing. It took additional analysis to confirm that the skeleton was female. The woman in the ground had been what she was for 2,500 years. The assumption that she could not have been what she was lasted until the second half of the 20th century. That is the story of the Amazon, really. That is the structure of the whole long myth, from Herodotus to the modern archaeological survey. Not a story about what women can or cannot do, but a story about what the people telling the story are willing to see. Tomyris watched Cyrus build his bridge across the Araxes. She sent her message. She fought her battle. She won. The bones of her people are scattered across the steppe in hundreds of kurgans, and they keep saying the same thing in the only language bones have. We were here. We were real. We did not lose. The story of the Amazons is not a Greek story about female transgression finally put right. It is a steppe story about what happens when a people develop over centuries, a social order that has room in it for women to be warriors, and what happens when a different civilization, one built on different principles, encounters that social order and cannot accommodate it, and has to make a myth to explain why it must be defeated. The myth was never quite convincing. The bones were always there to contradict it. And every time an archaeologist opens a Scythian-era kurgan and finds a woman buried with a sword, the myth loses another argument it has been making for 2,500 years. The grass grows back. The kurgans stand. The wind moves across them as it has always moved, carrying no information about who built them or what they believed or how they mourned their dead. The dead are in the ground. The story is in our mouths. The warrior women of the steppe were not Amazons in the Greek sense. They did not cut off their right breasts. They did not live apart from men in a city of women. They did not fight eternally against civilization as its symbolic opposite. They were people who lived complex lives on a difficult landscape and found within that complexity room for what we would now call gender fluidity in social role, room for female excellence in the domain of arms, room for women to be fully what their capacities made them. They were buried as what they had been. They were mourned by the people who had known them. They were placed in the ground with the things that had mattered to them in life, and they waited. They waited a long time. Good night, wherever you are, wherever you put the pin. The grass goes all the way to the edge of the world, and the edge is somewhere past where you can see, and somewhere in the dark between here and that horizon, under a low rise of earth that does not look like anything in particular. There is a woman who died holding a bow. She has been waiting for someone to look. Thank you for looking with me tonight.